Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, August 12th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented Part 1, World Trade Center Building 7. This is Part 2, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. It's the best way to submit them. I'll also be looking at the YouTube chat and the Facebook comments under this video for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get into it. The Twin Towers. In terms of the design, some called it the crowning achievement of the international style. Others called it heartless modernism. Gigantic dumbness is what Robert Stern called it, famous architect. At any rate, however you feel about it, the towers became the tallest buildings in the world, supplanting the Empire State Building with its beautiful unfolding massing. So you can tell I'm biased in terms of the design. Then they became the tallest buildings in the world, but that was just one of the achievements here. They also got 50,000 occupants, office occupants, up to their places of work every day in each of the towers, with 140,000 visitors as well. There were 100 elevator cabs in each tower, and they did that by dividing the building into thirds and creating a sub-lobby or sky lobby. And then from there, people would transfer into more local elevators to get to their destination. But the structural innovation is what's truly extraordinary, because up until that time, we had a forest of columns through these two buildings, through these skyscrapers in general up to that time. With the Twin Towers, what they did was push half the columns out to the outside, becoming an exoskeleton with these 3 vertical columns and 3 horizontal spandrel panels welded in the shop, brought out and erected with bolts onto the site. And so this is quite an innovation, because the columns throughout the building before impeded the ability of the tenants to lay out their office spaces. In between the interior massive core of 47 impressive steel columns, and the exterior were these floor trusses, which spanned up to 60 feet in the long direction, as you can see here, allowing this unimpeded access and layout of their office space. 35 feet on the sides as well. As you can see here, this was a complete innovation in modern office skyscraper design. But there were still some problems. The ceilings were perceived as being low by the tenants. The columns around the outside were perceived by some as likened unto being in a jail cell, with these columns marching every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the building. So you have some problems here that still haven't been resolved, because in the 80s and 90s, the structural innovations continued to open up the view to the landscape, the cityscape below. So also in this building, completed in the 70s, you had asbestos, a huge problem, and the Port Authority was requiring the city was requiring the Port Authority to abate the asbestos according to federal law. That was a huge $5 billion problem. And they also had a lot of electrical, mechanical, and communications systems that had to be upgraded to compete with the surrounding developing cityscape around them of office buildings. So it was a huge problem. So we have Larry Silverstein acquiring the Twin Towers. He had already built Building 7, which we talked about last week in this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. And you can see that free on YouTube if you missed the 3rd tower that came down on 9/11, the 47-story skyscraper that drops like a rock into its own footprint in the afternoon of 9/11. Very important to see. So Larry Silverstein acquires in quite a deal, in putting in only 125 million of his, 15 million of his own money, leveraged 125 million by his partners, leveraged to 3.2 billion in a deal to acquire these buildings just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. So that's a fascinating story, but not ours. Let's see what happened on the day of 9/11 and how this story developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes have flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell. And from Gene Corley, paid by the government to develop these narratives and distribute them. So let's see if that's true. We're going to pursue this line of inquiry today based on that original assessment there, essentially. Let's look at the planes. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning. It collapses 102 minutes later, about an hour and a half. So it's not the planes or the massive explosion that brought the towers down. In fact, NIST, the agency who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, has said that the fuel was burned up, 90% of it outside the tower. The rest of it was gone in just 10 minutes. So essentially the jet fuel just served to light a fire. So with some broken columns and some effects of the office fires on the steel, this is the official cause of these buildings' collapse. Similar at the South Tower, hit at 9:03, it collapses about an hour later. So it's hit about 30 stories down versus 15 stories down for the North Tower. Well, there were some official investigations, starting with volunteers who worked themselves into the subsequent investigations, including FEMA report, which came out in 2002. They finally had $600,000 worth of funding, but their efforts were quite hampered. According to the New York Times, they couldn't get access to the site, to the blueprints of the buildings, crucial information appealing to the public to get photographs. Their hands were tied. Fascinating. NIST came along in 2000 and was instructed by Congress to do a thorough job, and they had $20 million worth of funding. And NIST, by the way, is part of the executive branch under the Bush administration. Their leadership was changed out when the Bush administration came in. Their theory was a column failure theory. Essentially, the buildings had fires that caused the sagging of these floor trusses, because the lightweight steel trusses were said to have had their fireproofing scraped off or knocked off by the airplane impact. This caused them to sag and caused them to pull in the perimeter columns. However, sagging floor trusses can't pull in perimeter columns, so what do? They impose an artificial 5,000-pound load to make sure those columns were buckled all the way around the building. So then not being able to support the building. So that's the kind of fraud that we begin exposing here, but it just gets a lot worse, because these are the only fires that we have at the time of the collapse. As you can see, they're quite diminished. They are filled with the black smoke, indicating oxygen starved and cooler fires. So we don't have the kind of fires that can do the kind of damage that NIST is claiming. And we'll talk about the heat produced by that fire in a moment. So we use the scientific method. What is that? We have a question. How do the towers come down? We do background research, make observations. How have other towers come down? This is a hypothesis. It's our best guess as to how the towers came down. Maybe the planes brought them down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires, or maybe it was the explosions, for which we have plenty of evidence we'll be looking at today, and as well as controlled demolition. So yeah, we'll be looking at all of the rational hypotheses that make sense. We don't focus in on our favorite one because of our own political or financial obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter. The scientific method is objective. So we test these predictions that we make based on these hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that is being done. And if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back, we construct another hypothesis. which stands a better chance against the evidence, the experiments, the research, etc. And that's what we're about today, until we can come up with a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. So let's begin doing some background research. What are some of the forces that destroy tall buildings? Fire is certainly a dangerous force. It's organic, a chaotic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes, though, and then moves on looking for fresh new combustibles. So even NIST acknowledges that the fires didn't persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. That's all the fuel there is in our modern office buildings to offer a fire. So that's important to realize. And skyscrapers have never collapsed in due to fires, even though we have much hotter, longer lasting, and larger fires in these buildings than we have in the Twin Towers. But say in a wood frame building, what would be the mode of destruction? It would fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the tons of supporting structure beneath. And this has been tested, as we saw last week, by British Steel in Cardington in the worst test of its kind, the worst case scenario. 8-story buildings built out of fireproofed and non-fireproofed steel framing and set on fire with incredible fuel loads, as you see here, trying to get those office fires as hot as they possibly can. And what was the result? They found that steel is inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of its form. It might warp, as you see here in this unfireproofed beam, but the connections don't fail, which is where we saw NIST's focus of failure in the case of Building 7 on the steel connections. But as you can see here, they are the most secure. They want, if they don't want the connections to fail. If the beam is going to fail, let it fail somewhere else. They might sag, but they typically don't fail. But let's look at some of these skyscrapers that have endured very hot fires.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did any of the subsequent fully engulfed skyscrapers collapse due to these fires since 9/11. But these few small fires at the World Trade Center are said to have brought this building completely down to the ground. Do you get a sense of why we're taking a second look at this and the evidence that might have really been responsible for destroying this building? Well, how are buildings destroyed? We have Interesting. A local area emergency by FEMA. Would love it. That's timely. We have these buildings where there's thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds because of the explosions increasing rapidly their size in their cauliflower-shaped forms. We have they're expanding rapidly due to the incredible heat from the hot gases from the explosives. And we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Explosions are not a part of the official story of the Twin Towers destruction. And explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down buildings, as you see in this series of controlled demolitions, where the explosives or shaped cutter charges are spaced very carefully, engineered to the critical points at the columns and beams in order to remove them so that the building can be brought down in a controlled fashion, as you see. So there's a set of typical features that we note that occur with a controlled demolition: a sudden onset of destruction, a straight down symmetrical collapse. Usually that's what they want to achieve, because there's a patterned removal of column supports, resulting in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, but since the columns are removed, and therefore we have the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. There's limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. At feature number 7, there's patterned explosions heard by witnesses. There's flashes of light seen by them. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. If there's broken up concrete, in this case, completely powdered in the case of the Twin Towers, as we'll see, but we don't want to have to go back and jackhammer those floors. Let the explosives break them up into sizes which can be loaded quite easily on trucks. Explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And of course, evidence left behind, the chemical evidence and other kinds of evidence of explosive devices. If you have these features, you know you have destruction with explosives. That's direct evidence. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. So if you have, this is obviously, the engineers were stunned by what happened. A modern steel frame high-rise had never collapsed due to uncontrolled fire. Why? Well, one reason is the steel conducts the heat away from the source of the heat. So it never reaches its 1200 degree temperature Fahrenheit, at which it can sag and begin to lose half of its strength and then sag. But to keep that from happening, and that can happen, so we put cementitious fireproofing on, protecting the beams for 2 hours in a fire, and protecting the columns for up to 3 hours in a fire, even though fires don't persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. So this is 4 to 6 times the amount of protection that should be required to protect this steel. But we also require the tenants to not bring in huge fuel loads, and require the contractors to not build these buildings out of combustible materials. And then we, on top of all of that, we put sprinklers to keep fires from ever becoming a problem. In the case of the Twin Towers, the sprinklers were said to have been compromised by the plane impacts. So with additional circumstantial and corroborative evidence, which can be quite helpful, government documentation, foreknowledge of the destruction, experts agreeing, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter as to what is a controlled demolition. Video documentation, of course, all can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof which we're going to apply now to the Twin Towers, beginning with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? And where is that? At the location of the jet plane impacts, because this is where we are led to focus on the problem, which is said to be the planes and the fires there. So let's take a look. Here's the North Tower. It's standing still, and then suddenly, smoothly, it drops straight down. No jolting, no hesitation, no impact with floors hitting the next level of intact structure. Let's look at the South Tower, standing still, and all of a sudden, smooth downward descent. So yeah, we do have sudden destruction. Do we have patterned explosions and flashes of light? Well, let's go to the oral histories first of the first responders, commissioned by Thomas von Essen, city commissioner, fire commissioner. He was able to get the recordings of 500 of his first responders on tape within a month or so. And this was being held by the city of New York. But the New York Court State of Appeals forced them to release this information finally to the New York Times, which was suing them for it. And they got it. And these transcripts are now published on the website. It turns out that at first, Graham McQueen, an incredible researcher, in 2011, 10 years later, worked his way through these transcripts and finds that 118 of them observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena of explosive demolition. Let's look at these. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, you're going to hear this order of events, which is very specific. The ground is shaking, or we heard explosions, all before the collapse of the building. This is extremely important because we're told by NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that it's the building collapsing causing these phenomena. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the top simultaneously from all four sides. Materials shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. I saw flash, flash, flash. You know, like when they demolish a building. And this, by the way, at the lower level of the building. Wait, the plane impact and the collapse is supposed to be happening at the upper level of the building. There was an explosion in the South Tower. I kept watching. One floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. I saw flash, flash, flash. You know, like when they demolish a building at the lower level, once again, at the lower level of the building. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's see what they're talking about. Here is the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Slowing it down halfway, is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to at least warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire The official cause of this building's collapse has never brought down a skyscraper. In fact, shouldn't controlled demolition have been the first hypothesis, if not the only one? But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions posted years later on NIST's website. Why didn't NIST consider a controlled demolition? Wherein they say, we don't support the controlled demolition. The collapse was initiated in the impact of the floors of the World Trade Center and nowhere else. In the video evidence also showed unambiguously that the collapse progressed from top to bottom, as if controlled demolitions can't do that. Any blast or explosion in the region below the impact, NIST found no corroborating evidence for alternative hypotheses suggesting that the towers are brought down by controlled demolition. Well, today we're showing you a whole lot of evidence that they seemed to overlook. Back to the witnesses. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and then you hear a pop, 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 pop? That's when I heard that friggin' noise. That's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. A number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. That's down low in the building. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. Whoops, I just read that. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building. And then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower on the right, compared to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since, again, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a steel frame fireproof skyscraper? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with large fireballs that blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolish a building, that's what I saw. That's what I thought I saw. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at that point still thought these buildings were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Firefighter John Coyle. Let's listen to these witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. and another explosion came right on the building, flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there's those secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building, is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower rather that has collapsed, and we are told collapsed because of a third explosion. And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
They were plans to take down a building.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How much of this testimony do you imagine was included in any of the reports? 0. We'll do it like this. 0. None. Why? Is this important testimony? Are these credible witnesses? What are we looking at here? NIST claims it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't begin at the bottom. What? Let's listen to Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a top-down controlled demolition. NIST says, well, the top part, 15 stories in the case of the North Tower, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. This is called the crush down, crush up theory, which became their column failure theory. There's a few problems with this theory. It completely disobeys Newton's third law of motion, that there's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide. For instance, a Mack truck and a Volkswagen, who's going to win? The heavier, stronger structure. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. The lightest part of a structure and weakest can't possibly destroy the cold, hard steel below, which is heavier and heavier and stronger as we go down. This is a column up at the top, but as you go down, they get heavier and heavier like this at mid-height, 2 inches by 32 inches by 16 inches, and then almost solid steel as you get down to the bottom. So there's a real problem with this theory. And it was submitted originally by Zdeněk Bezant from Chicago Northwestern University. It is the crush down, crush up theory, but the paper, interestingly, was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. The rest of us are in shock and awe, trying to figure out, if there are more attacks coming, what happened? We didn't even know that there were hijackers or their identities or what other targets might be aimed at. So there's a few problems with this paper, many problems. Actually, the formulas are technically correct, but the input data is completely falsified, not to mention obscured, so that engineers couldn't even decode it. But it was finally decoded by some hardworking engineers, and they found what? They completely eliminated a story of columns, 287 columns, so that the building could develop a false impact force on the structure below. The upper section could fall freely for 12 feet. There were only a few broken columns, maybe a dozen or so. They doubled the mass up above falsely. They decreased the column strength below by 3 times. They decreased the velocity loss. It would have been due to the law of conservation of momentum by hitting one floor, losing some velocity, then hitting the next, etc. And they completely eliminated the column reserve strength. Those columns are 3 times stronger than they needed to be. So the results are that they've rigged the collapse 12-1 in favor of a collapse. They've rigged the calculations. Probably 24-1 or even greater by the time you do all this math. So we have the Bezant theorizing very close to what was actually measured and observed, a near free fall collapse. But in reality, velocity on the left, time on the right, we'd lose in 5. We'd lose really quickly the downward momentum, and it would be arrested and come to a stop in just 2 seconds. That's what really would have happened. So there were engineers that refuted these. In the American Society of Civil Engineers journal, refused to correct the fraudulent paper that Zdeněk Bezant did. And so Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns and Gregory Zudolinski submitted papers, and except the fraud was upheld by the American Society of Civil Engineers. They won't publish the papers. Why? They say they're out of scope. What? How can it be out of scope to publish to a paper that refutes the previously in scope paper? So there is an ethical challenge going on right now at the American Society of Civil Engineers. So let's look at the upper section and see if in fact there is a pile driver. Well, we can make it easier for you. Look at the bottom red line here. We're told that the whole upper section drives the rest of the building down, but you can see that it is destroying itself, just like the Volkswagen would be running into the Mack truck. It is destroying itself. There's a question here. What's destroying it? Is it the structure below, or is it these explosions that you already see evidence of between the two red lines? Starting and stopping. You see what? Hey, hold on a second. We start and we stop. Just like the firefighters described, bands of explosions all the way around the building. So back to NIST's column failure theory. They focus on inward bowing columns because that is actually what we do see in this looped video in this corner of the tower. The columns are being pulled in. Very interesting. Why? That's the question. Well, let's go to FEMA report before NIST took it over and co-opted it.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
Very interesting. So FEMA originally documented that the antenna drops first. You can actually see that here. 1, 2, back 2, forward 2, back 2. That's about 10 feet drop right there. Back 2, forward 2. Well, what's the antenna sitting on? It sits on the hat truss. What's the hat truss sitting on? It sits on the core columns. So just like FEMA said, the core columns are failing first, contrary to what NIST said, which was the perimeter columns failing first. The hat truss and antenna descend when the core columns descend, because that's what they're sitting on. The core columns then pull on the floor trusses, and then the floor trusses pull in the perimeter columns. Something like this, which we have this crude animation from an unknown source. Well, somebody knows it. I don't. So the core columns, what's causing the core columns to descend is the question here, right? They must have been, some of those core columns must have been removed. Well, how did that happen? This is all well below the airplane damage, which is at the top of this image. And nowhere do we see a top section of the building driving the rest of it down to the ground in any of the photos or videos. It would be right here in this photo. It's been destroyed. And if it weren't destroyed, it would have crushed these remaining core columns, which last 6 seconds after the destruction of the building. It would have crushed them too. So this video alone destroys the credibility of the NIST report. And then there's an explosion which shakes the dust off of these columns in the air. And then you can see it descending frame by frame through the dust. It is not turning to dust, as some people say. Does it look like a collapse? Or does it look like hundreds of explosions or thousands? In the case of the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009, with upward, outward arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll get to in part 3 of this 3-part series. Does it even look like a gravitational collapse to you? Feature number 2, is there straight down symmetrical progression? Well, let's take a look. Here's the South Tower. It begins to tip over. Okay, that's interesting. Why is it tipping over? That's what you might expect in any kind of a natural collapse, but it's tipping over at 22 degrees. So we have asymmetrical loading on the structure below. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, impact on the columns up above. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. How in the world do we get then complete symmetrical damage following all of that straight down the building, all around the building? It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense. Something very ordered is occurring here, very controlled. And here's the leading edge of it. What are we seeing? A gravitational collapse, which we're told is 20 stories up above this point, or hundreds of explosions, floor by floor, at least dozens in this looped video. Allow your eyes to see what's in front of you. And if you can't, here's another view of that same corner in the lower right, racing down almost as fast as the freely falling debris outside of it. We'll see how fast that is in a moment. We have a 200-foot wide building, but the debris is straight down or symmetrical about the tower, all around it, in a 1,200 to 1,400 foot radius, as indicated by the FEMA report damage location of the exterior perimeter structural steel sections, destroying the winter gardens in the World Financial Center to the west, 600 feet to the west. As you can see here, the steel frame is completely broken up and distributed symmetrically. Broken up, ready for loading and shipment, actually. Here is the nice, neat pile of Building 7, a classic implosion. Out here, we have the very explosive event known as the destruction of the World Trade Center, evidenced by additional damage inside the World Trade Center 6 particularly. Do we have ejections of building materials at the lower floors? Well, let's take a look at these isolated explosions occurring 20, 40, 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse up above. NIST says, well, these are puffs of air being produced by that pile driver driving the rest of the building down to the ground. That air's got to go somewhere, right? Well, these are not puffs of air. They're solid objects, and we'll see how fast they occur. But say they were puffs of air being produced by that pile driver and they got to come out somewhere, right? Well, in the open office planning that we have in these buildings, that air would be emerge out of the elevator hoistway and blow out all these windows or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate violent ejections. Let's look at them as they occur on the South Tower on the left side. We have dozens of them virtually at once. The destruction inside this tilting section of the tower is incredible, evidenced by what's going on here. No wonder it doesn't fall off of its center of axis on this building, because it later rights itself. It comes back down. It's been destroyed from the inside. Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour, 160 to 200 feet per second. They're calculated at also. These are explosive speeds, not air pressure being pumped out. How fast is the building coming down? Let's go to a timed animation on the left, a video, and an animation on the right. Nine seconds. In about 12 seconds, the building has been completely shattered into the ground. What does that mean? Let's go back again to physics teacher David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall, almost free fall. It's not slowing down, it's speeding up. And through what? All of this steel. There's more steel here on the outside than glass. How is it traveling, accelerating straight down through that? Remember, steel columns, when they buckle, still have resistance. Any resistance would slow down the acceleration to deceleration. Steel columns like these have 25% of their minimum of their capacity, even when they're buckled. So that's what's being shown here. Let's look at it another way. On the right, we have a giant crane holding up a 15-story section, like in the North Tower of this building, over nothing but air. On the left, we take the same section and we even give it 12 feet of magical dropping force so we can develop a dynamic impact on the structure below. Below that, 80,000 tons of structural steel, 5 times stronger than it needs to be to resist a static load up above. We're going to release the lever on these at the same time. What happens? This is 7th grade physics. It's intuitive. We know that the structure on the right is going to fall about as fast as NIST says it did, which is NIST said free fall. Shyam Sundar said that. The left side, it's going to impact and slow down and in all likelihood stop because the structure below, again, is a virtual pyramid. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger. There'll be an equal and opposite destructive force. This is not difficult to imagine, and it's not difficult to calculate, as has been done here by Massimo Mazzucco in his film September 11th, New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with two towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, and that is why we have the persistent effort of engineers like Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns and Gregory Zudolinski submitting papers that, in fact, have been published in the Journal of Protective Structures. So some success out there. Do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame? Well, the National Fire Protection Association 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says, hey, look for shrapnel effects, high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris, with the building completely demolished and debris thrown great distances. Well, we're going to be looking at all of that. Starting here with the shrapnel effects, the building is completely shattered to the ground, save these remaining shards of perimeter steel structure, broken up into its original 37.5-foot lengths, ready for loading and shipment. Do we have the lateral ejection of structural steel components? Well, going back again to the NFPA 921, says look for blast pressure wave effects. The heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, like you see, impaled in the surrounding buildings and destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away. And like you see in this stop and start video of these captured moments of these freely flying structural steel sections ejected independently laterally out of the Twin Towers, like this one. This is 45 degrees here, back to forward to, it starts out horizontally, as you can see. In fact, it starts out up, as you can see, but then out, and then gravity begins to take over and pulls at 45. What is the outward force throwing these thousands of 4-ton structural steel sections laterally? Well, let's go to David Chandler and see if we can learn something.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds. I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
So about 80 miles per hour, these are shot out of the World Trade Center. That's enough energy to fire a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's that energy coming from? And by the way, if 100,000 tons of structural steel framing is distributed, almost all of it outside the footprint, you have to ask yourself, what is crushing the building? Because it's not available to crush the building below it. What's that crushing force? You say, maybe it's the concrete. Well, let's look at that. Because the concrete is not found down at the bottom either. There's 110 floors, each of them an acre in size, of 4-inch thick and 8-inch thick concrete slabs. They're not found in a pile on the left here at the World Trade Center North Tower or the South Tower. We're looking for pancakes like we see in a real gravitational collapse in Mexico on the right. We don't find 100. We don't find 50. We don't find 10 floors. We don't find one an acre in size. Very, very few pieces of concrete. It's missing. What happened to it? Oh, here it is, pulverized in midair before it ever reaches the ground, developing its kinetic energy and crashing into powder on the ground. No, it's pulverized. 90,000 tons of concrete missing from each of the buildings. Pulverized into average size of 100 micron particles. This is like powder. And covering lower Manhattan in a 3-inch blanket over a 3 square mile area, 30% of which is powdered concrete. That's where the concrete is. Let's go to Governor Pataki. Uh-oh. I don't know what that was. Let's see if we can go to Governor
You
Pataki.
see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum.
You have two.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 210-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, by the way, oh boy, hang on one second. We're gonna fix this. There we go. If 90,000 tons of concrete is pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, what's crushing the building? It wasn't the steel. It's not the concrete. Together, these are more than 2/3 the weight of the building. They're not available to crush the building. Think about it. Something else is destroying this building. And all the file cabinets, except for this one, which is the only one that they could find. It was saved, I guess, because it was in the basement. It was in an ice cream store. Where did 10,000 file cabinets, steel file cabinets, go? Where did the people go?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We're talking about 700 bone fragments found on the top of this building, the Deutsche Bank building. Well, they didn't come from the people in this airplane because it hit the South Tower and its ejections went out this way. It didn't come from the people in this airplane because it hit the North Tower and those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by the South Tower. So they're not from the people in the planes. Many of them were from firefighters, as you see by the red triangles. We don't have all 700, of course, focused here. But of course, the firefighters were not on the scene at the time of the plane impacts. So it wasn't from the people in the planes. There were 2,753 victims now altogether, but only 300 whole bodies were found. Most of those were jumpers. There were 21,900 pieces of bodies found. 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, still, more than 1,100 victims remain completely unaccounted for. They were vaporized. Those that were accounted for were spread over a distance of 800 feet radius outside the perimeter of each of these towers. We'd expect these bodies to be trapped between floors that were falling and certainly mangled. But what we have evidence of here is something altogether different. And what we've seen so far in part 2 of this 3-part series is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, especially these fires that are diminished and cooler, indicated by the thick black smoke. With additional testimony and research work on the part of Graham McQueen in 2015, he increased that number from 118 witnesses among these 503 FDNY professionals to 156 that observed explosions. So that work is now available. And 36 reporters, additionally, TV reporters, brought us the Twin Towers explosive demolition also. Let's dig into this, because there's a widely held belief that the Twin Towers collapsed as a result of the airplane impacts and the resulting fires. That's a revisionist history or theory we're going to show you. The vast majority of TV reporters on the ground who witnessed and who reported the event firsthand cited explosions as the cause of the collapse, which you're going to see here. Most people have no idea because the story changed abruptly the next day when the local TV anchors and national mainstream outlets reported a different story. Fire Marshal John Coyle, firefighter Christopher Fenyo, explicitly support this finding. I thought it was exploding, actually. That's what I thought for hours afterward. Everybody, I think, at that point still thought these things were blown up, as we heard earlier. At that point, a debate began to rage about whether to continue the rescue operations in the other still standing tower, because the perception was the building looked like it had been taken out with charges. And firefighters don't go into buildings that are exploding. They're not supposed to. Graham McQueen and Ted Walters' new research is the systematic effort to collect and analyze the news clips from more than 70 hours of original coverage from that day. 3 categories of reporting is what they found: eyewitness reporting, narrative reporting, and source-based reporting. The condensed video clips, which I'm going to show you right now, reveal the impressive quantity, clarity, and magnitude of the explosive reporting on the day of 9/11.
But as I was looking up, I saw the entire explosion. It looked exactly like the first 2, but we certainly had the most perfect vantage point for that explosion. It was unbelievable. And
there has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising, and I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower.
Towers, a huge explosion now waiting to play on all of us.
We're not sure exactly what happened, but there was another explosion on the far side of one of the buildings from where we're standing. The reverberation and another explosion on the right-hand side.
Watch the right
It's
side.
exploding.
It's ripping apart.
On the far side of the building, there seemed to be another explosion, and also on the right-hand side, there was also another explosion. We're not sure if that was extra reverberation from what happened at the World Trade Center, or if that was an added explosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
Again, there has been a second explosion here in Manhattan at the Trade Center.
And believe it or not, there was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down, sending smoke and debris everywhere.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion,
A huge explosion, a huge rumbling cloud. We're taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
But it literally exploded and came down as though it had been hit.
We heard an explosion.
The explosion happened was shooting pieces of the plane. There are pieces of the plane on Church Street.
There's another explosion as we speak.
something either exploded or fell off the side of the one building that was attacked.
Then the entire top of the building just blew up.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
It was just a small explosion, and then rocks and debris and everything started pouring down. And we were about 2 blocks away when the second explosion hit, and all we heard was just this small explosion. Then we saw a roar of an explosion, and all kinds of smoke coming, billowing out, debris falling down.
It's unbelievable because you hear these explosions. In fact, I just heard another one. I don't know if it was like an after effect or whatnot, just while you were on the phone talking about the school closing. I'm hearing another explosion, just so you know. I'm hearing another rumble. It's what you can feel when these tremors come is that it literally comes up under your feet. That's what it feels like. That's the best way I know to describe it.
Certainly didn't imagine that there would be second or tertiary explosions, so they parked some of their vehicles in those areas, and many of those vehicles, people in those vehicles, have lost their lives.
Well, we just heard another explosion go off a couple of minutes ago, Chris, and saw a bunch more people sort of running this way. A woman on her bike was screaming as it went off, and there was a New York City officer. He was plain clothes walking by with a radio. I tried to stop him to ask what happened, and all he said was car bomb, and then I couldn't press him for any more information. He said when that last bomb went, or when that last collapse happened, and
When the first tower collapsed, it was a massive explosion. When that explosion occurred, it was like the scene out of a horror film. Another explosion, a rolling blast of fire, a rolling column of fire towards us. You saw people being wheeled on gurneys away from the site of the explosion. I looked up, and that's when I heard the, pardon me, that's when I heard the explosion. That's when the second tower came down.
It was an explosion.
2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion.
But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower.
Saw the explosion and also the collapse of the tower.
With subsequent explosions and explosions were coming down the building. It looked as if charges had been set on each floor and they were in succession going off.
He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. But the bottom line is that according to the chief of safety of the New York City Fire Department, he says that he probably lost a great many men in those secondary explosions.
Put us about a block and a half away from the site of where the explosion was. So their fear is that there may have been explosive devices planted either in the building or in the adjacent area.
Office supplies, many blocks from the site of the actual explosion where they now...
I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street. And after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped.
And I was walking on Broadway at Fullerton, and suddenly we heard an explosion. It was the first tower coming down. I started to walk out. I walked down Broadway towards Canal, and we heard a second explosion.
Covered in the debris and the dust from the explosion itself. It was rocked with a lot of the explosion from the force of the twin World Trade Centers when they came down.
I was out front as you were when the second explosion occurred, because the explosion threw debris on top of a lot of people. That was when the real panic began.
Sequence of crashes, then explosions, and then the collapses.
This must have been ground zero where this thing blew up. Car after car after car. Buses completely obliterated and burned straight down to the steel.
That's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point.
The first wave of rescue workers who went in were trapped, many of them killed by the second blast.
And escaped through the lobby, where they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
So I believe the bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
And NIST claimed that there were no witnesses of explosions. Well, what happened to these TV reporters, half of whom were direct witnesses? 21 of them, in fact, eyewitnesses, personally perceived as explosions before and or during the destruction. 22 narrative reports where they refer to the destruction as an explosion-based event. And 3 of them source-based reports from the FDNY, the NYPD, the FBI, the 3 most important governmental agencies involved, who said that they suspected that explosives were used to bring down the Twin Towers. The FBI even called it their working theory before they were obviously restrained somehow. Only 4 of the reporters described the collapse as a result of plane impacts or the ensuing fires. Let's look at those. Their individual accounts add little to support to what very soon became the official collapse hypothesis, and 2 of them were more than 12 blocks away. The third actually stated, quote, "The entire building has just collapsed as if a demolition team set off when you see the demolitions of those old buildings." The 4th was quite close to the South Tower near Ron and Santa, who vividly described seeing the building exploding and hearing a noise associated with an implosion. So they seem to be expressing their uninformed opinions, or else carrying out someone else's instructions about the cause of the collapse. Unlike the 118 first responders who provided their accounts weeks or months after the event, it was the job of these reporters to spontaneously communicate their perception and interpretation of the events. Thus, when their reporting is compiled into one record, we are left with a rich and largely unfiltered collective account of what really took place the morning of 9/11. Considered alongside the FDNY oral histories, these reporters' statements constitute strong, corroborating evidence that explosives were used to destroy the towers. The hypothesis was not only prevalent among reporters, but was clearly the dominant hypothesis. The 21 instances of eyewitness reporting, all of which contain spontaneous descriptions of the phenomena the reporters witnessed, also strongly corroborates the overwhelming scientific evidence, which you will also see in this presentation and the following one next week in part 3 of this 3-part series, that explosives were used to destroy the towers. Now, the remaining research for the McQueen-Walter team is to examine how the hypothesis of fire-induced collapse so quickly supplanted the original dominant explosion collapse hypothesis, i.e., how the story got hijacked by the mainstream media the day after 9/11. Well, there's yet more witnesses here. In this case, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory 20 miles north of the Twin Towers. What did they witness? Now, FEMA and NIST reports relied on the Columbia University report, and there were seismic signals near the time of the airplane impacts. So necessarily, perhaps it was deemed to be caused by the plane impacts. Maybe a rational pursuit hypothesis at first. So let's look at it in more greater clarity. Well, first of all, that was at the South Tower. In the case of that was the North Tower. Back here, there, that was the North Tower. A 0.9 magnitude event near the time of the plane impacts. In South Tower, it's a 0.7 magnitude event near the time of the plane impacts. Let's dig into this, though, because the seismic event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds, but the plane doesn't impact for another 14 seconds, according to the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within a second. So how can the plane impacts cause the seismic event 14 seconds earlier? Doesn't make sense. NIST comes along and says, well, gosh, we reviewed the videos and we think the plane impacted 10 seconds earlier than that. What? You're just going to ignore the NTSB radar that the 9/11 Commission relied on that's accurate to within 1 second? Well, you still got 4 seconds away. So what are you going to do with that? They went back to LDEO, Columbia University, which runs the observatory, contracted with them privately, producing a report that we can't see that somehow got them to move their data back 3 seconds. So now they're only off by 1 second. This is the kind of tampering with evidence that has to be looked at carefully in a real investigation. What about the second plane impact at the South Tower? 0.7 magnitude event occurring at 9:02 and 54 seconds. But according to NTSB, the plane doesn't hit until 17 seconds later. NIST comes back and say, well, we looked at the videos, we did some timings, and we think they're wrong. Plane impacted 12 seconds earlier than that. What? But you're still off by 5 seconds. What do? Go back to LDEO and get them to move their data back 3 seconds in the same report that we can't have access to. Okay, well, what could have produced seismic events at that time in the towers? Mike Picaro said the whole building seemed to shake and there was a loud explosion when they arrived at the sea level of the basement halfway down. They found the machine shop gone, nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press, gone. The two made their way to the parking garage, found it too was gone. I don't know what that means, but it's extensive damage, certainly. A steel and concrete fire door that weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil and lying on the floor. A bomb had gone off in the building. He's not the only one. There were many. And here's another. William Rodriguez, janitor, a hero in the, according to George Bush and others, many others, because he saved so many people. He says the bomb went off in the basement before the plane hit the building. He's been consistent about this story for almost 20 years.
Was a janitor, like I said, on that day there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
So corroborating witnesses that a bomb went off before the plane hit the building. Well, that's corroborated also here by applied geophysics expert Andre Rousseau, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive waves, mechanical waves, and geology. He says the frequency of the Raleigh waves, the main seismic waves, attributed by LDEO to the impacts, were on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. Aircraft crash impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz and often around 100 hertz, 2 orders of magnitude. But those frequencies were filtered out by the bandpass filters used by LDEO, so they couldn't even have recorded air crash impacts, airplane impacts. The range of the instruments cited by LDEO does not allow for the recording of such waves. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions, which are around 1 hertz. So he says the seismic signals are not from airplane impacts. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened even before hitting the ground. All right. We have more seismic events around the time of the building collapse also. In fact, there's a 2.1 magnitude event at the South Tower. This was attributed by NIST to the building collapse hitting the ground. At the North Tower, we have a 2.3 magnitude event. Again, near the time of the collapse, NIST attributing it to being caused by the collapse. Let's dig into it. When does the seismic event happen? 10:28 and 31 seconds. Okay. The tower starts its descent about 9 seconds before that, but the first debris strikes the ground about a second after that event, but the heaviest debris strikes the ground about 4 seconds later. So how can the heaviest debris, which is attributed to causing the event, seismic signal, cause it if it's happening 4 seconds later? Well, NIST says, we don't think that's what happened. We're going back to LDEO and get them to move their data back another 3 seconds in a report which we can't get the data for because they're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, being a private university. Okay, so what could it be? Well, look at these very well-defined primary waves and shear waves that are occurring before and immediately after the beginning of the descent of the tower. Very well defined, but completely ignored in the Columbia University report. What could be causing those? Do we have any evidence? 4 seconds before the tower starts descending, we're picking up very well defined primary waves. They come before the big Raleigh waves. Well, we have explosions recorded by cameras 6 and 10 seconds prior to the tower's descent. Interesting. Let's go to this camera, tripod mounted, research done by Professor Graham McQueen. Playing it here, and watch. There is the shake. The tower hasn't collapsed yet, but in 6 seconds, it begins its descent. So the tripod mounted camera is shaken 6 seconds before the descent. By what? Did somebody kick it? Well, if they didn't, then it would be corroborating all of the witnesses of the FDNY and others that we heard prior to the building going down. But we have additional corroboration, in this case, up on a roof, where right about here we have yet another shake occurring 10 seconds prior to the collapse of this north tower. And there's the smooth, sudden descent. So what about the south tower? We have the seismic event occurring at 9:59 and 04 seconds. The start of the tower's collapse, the south tower, doesn't happen until 5 seconds before that, and the heaviest debris, or the first debris, doesn't even strike the ground till 7 seconds after that. That's just the first debris. So how can NIST say that even the first debris striking the ground, they say, well, no, wait, we're going back to LDEO again. We're going to get them to move their data 3 seconds yet again in a report that will not be released, so that they can have their theory more adequately supported. Well, what could be responsible for those seismic events? We have, yet again, a camera shaking mounted on the ground prior to the descent of the South Tower. And that occurs 3 seconds prior to the start of the collapse of the building. And this one is more subtle. By the way, you can look at this information. Did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground? And this one's more subtle, so listen up. There's the shake, and 3 seconds later, there is the descent of the building. So this is a very important set of additional documentation of what's really causing the seismic evidence. The official narrative is that it's due to the debris hitting the ground, but we have a problem with this, right? It's not hitting the ground. It's hitting concrete floors that are suspended over the ground, i.e. the parking structure. And we're talking about no component from the concrete at all, because it's been pulverized to dust, right? The floor truss is pulverized, the gypsum board pulverized. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, 4 to 8 tons, peppering the ground over 15 seconds or 12 seconds. They're equally distributed around the entire World Trade Center superblock. So they're not coming down in one place or one time. As you can see, these towers have identical collapses. So they should also have identical seismic components but they don't. The North Tower is 1.6 times greater than the South Tower in energy release. This is what you get with the logarithmic scale, 2.3 versus 2.1. That's a 1.6 times greater energy. So what could be responsible for that? We have explosions that are apparently more conducive to higher energy release in the North Tower. Andre Rousseau says identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. This is very well summed up by Consensus 9/11, the best 9/11 evidence panel, with Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin leading the effort there. This is a point TT7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. Very well summarized. And some people say, well, gosh, the Seattle Kingdome made a 2.3 magnitude event. Well, it was a 25,000 ton concrete roof that impacts the ground virtually at once. We're not comparing apples to apples here at all, as we talked about. So these sources of research can be very important for your efforts in learning more as well. How about the FEMA and NIST reports? The NIST report, $20 million, 10,000 pages. They were tasked by Congress to explain how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. How and why they collapsed. But they had their own objective, which was actually hidden on footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Well, that's what you were tasked to do, explain the collapse, not the initiation of collapse. So $20 million, 10,000 pages, and you produced 1/2 of a page on the actual collapse. Well, let's read it. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through deformation. Came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. This is not calculation or explanation. It is speculation. Should have been called, it's a pre-collapse report, which should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse. Why did they avoid the collapse itself? Because had they gone any further in their research effort or their investigation, they would have had to account for all of the explosive evidence that occurs that actually brought down the towers. They would have had to calculate the capability of the intact cold hard structure below to resist a free-falling or near free-falling mass impacting it from above. But they could avoid all of that. So in their response to a request for correction, which we've now issued 2, they write back and they say, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the towers. Absolutely right. And they go further and say, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, they admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Well, wait, you can't find what you will not test for, and they didn't. What do the experts say? How about some of those experts among 100 signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation, as opposed to ones that have financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter? Let's look at William Rice. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor, while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, near free-fall collapse violates laws of physics. You can memorize that one. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Explosives, says New Mexico tech expert Van Romero, effects of explosions on buildings. That's his specialty. He says explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. He retracted this statement, presumably when he got pressure, because federal funding is his source of grants for that university. Apparently, Mathis Levy also got some pressure, because originally he said this.
If you've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
And Ronald Hamburger, who said, it appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Well, we've been seeing all kinds of evidence for bombs being detonated. Nevertheless, he retracted this as he became part of the FEMA team. Mike Taylor, Executive Director, National Association of Demolition Contractors. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. Andre Rousseau, even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles north and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. How about the evidence itself? Surely it was preserved in easily the three most puzzling structural failures in history. How about Abolhassan Astani Azal, structural engineer?
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
The evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling. What? Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In these incredible structural failures we have within 2 weeks after 9/11, 400 truckloads per day removing this debris. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which has prompted so many architects and engineers to come to the conclusion, based on the use of the scientific method, that explosions and controlled demolition are what's responsible here. But what do you think? What is your opinion? Do we have this week the 8 key characteristic features of direct evidence, at least, of destruction with explosives? Any of these features, can they be attributed to fire? No, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony by others, which we've been looking at. This, to so many, is proof of controlled demolition. And let's find out about you. What do you think? Andy will let you know how you can cast your vote there and give us a sense of any questions that you might have. Also, Andy.
Absolutely. My vote was cast years ago here. Okay, please submit any questions that you might have in the same input form, and we will do our best to answer them. That's the one at ae911truth.org. Go to continuing education and select the live webinars. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you. And that's the form right there. And while you're there, by the way, subscribe to our email newsletter. You can definitely get the latest evidence that we're putting together, the efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation, the activism that we're doing. So be a part of it. Take a minute and just put your email in there and get informed while you're there. We have an incredible body of evidence. We have lots and lots of videos, our booklet, our newsletters, technical articles, a whole lot more about all the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center 7. It's an incredible body of evidence. And while you're there too, sign the petition. Support the 3,400 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation, publicly staking their reputations on the actual evidence. They've become informed. So now that you're informed, you can share this evidence with others as well. And you can sign our petition. We have 20,000 supporting those 3,400. And donate while you're there too, because we're not rich. We don't get federal grants, corporate grants. It's thousands of you who keep us moving day by day through the efforts, the incredible heroic efforts that our team is making. And I encourage you to support them. We have 6 employees that do so much work. And this is where you can do that right on our website. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. You have tax deduction for you, and we need the support. We've got lots and lots of projects we're about. Become a member of AE 911 Truth for as little as a cup of coffee a month. You can join the family of sustaining supporters. So we encourage you to do that also. And volunteer if you can't. Andy, how do people volunteer with us?
Yeah, the first step is decide you're going to do it. The next step is go to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form right there. Very easy to fill out, just some basic information, and then we'll contact you and see how best you'll fit in. There's any kind of number of things you can do here. You can help us with some research, look up some addresses and whatnot to send information to other research as well as talking to the public and helping us out with our congressional outreach, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But like I always say every week, the first step is deciding that you want to be part of this team and help make a difference in this world. So please consider doing that.
Absolutely. And here's the teams that you can be a part of. So it's an incredible effort by a whole lot more volunteers than the staff that we have on board. You can also reach out to your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everybody you know. Screen the DVDs that we'll show you an example of one in a minute. Share the brochures one-on-one. The brochures like this one, our street brochure, which has a whole outline of the evidence that you can use to make people aware on the street And we also have our Good for America brochure, and with all the reasons that America needs the truth about 9/11, as well as the evidence insert inside. So take advantage of these opportunities in our store at ae911truth.org. You can download the 135-page finite element analysis that Professor Leroy Hulsey did, and he's from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. This is the study that NIST was tasked by Congress to do, but as we've been seeing in this series, failed miserably. And you can download it at WTC7evaluation.org and give that to structural engineers, architects, and others who will be interested in seeing it. And we have also all of this work that he did using two competing models for World Trade Center Building 7, modeling the fires and the structural response to the fires, and completely disproving the NIST theory that Building 7 came down due to those fires. And all of that was documented by Dylan Avery in the movie 7. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's available on DVD, available also on Amazon.com, and includes some of the work that we've done in our request for correction submitted to NIST, demanding a reality from them instead of the lies and the fraud that they have perpetrated on the American people and on structural engineers. And all of this you can take to Congress. Andy, how does that work?
Absolutely. Our congressmen are supposed to be there to represent us. And of course, this audience is this issue is very important to this audience. Of course, what happened to the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7 on September 11th. So we got to take it to Congress. Now, the first step is to go to your congressman or congresswoman's website and find how to get a meeting with them. Most of them will take it over the phone right now because of the current situation with the pandemic. And you can select to have a meeting with them and make the request and include architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. We'll come on the meeting with you and we will talk to them about the evidence and, of course, about the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's path to justice for the nearly 3,000 people who died on that day, and is named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed outside the North Tower lobby as he was entering on that morning. So what it would do is it would create a select committee. It can be passed in either House of Congress to look into the evidence that Richard has been presenting for years. So we need Congress to act on this, but they don't do anything unless they hear from their constituents. So that's why you need to get involved and take that first step. And if you need any help with it, just write to us at congress@ae911truth.org.
Beautiful. Thanks, Andy. And we've got lawsuits in place. The grand jury investigation is one of them. We've submitted all this evidence in 60 exhibits to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, and that's going through its legal hurdles. So stand by, as is the FBI, which lawsuit, which has now been submitted to the Supreme Court of the United States. We hope they'll accept this case because it will show that we do have standing as family members and architects and engineers in the FBI's negligent omission of our evidence in their submittal to the 2015 Commission review to Congress. So that's happening, as is the imminent submittal to the court, the Attorney General of the United Kingdom, for a new inquest into the murder of Jeff Campbell, who was in the North Tower, the 106th floor. And of course he was, well, not of course, but he was killed by explosions, and the damage to his body proves that overwhelmingly. So a new inquiry into his death is very important for his family, of course, but for all of us and the other family members in the UK. So that's coming up. And so all of that the evidence that we've been talking about today is summarized in this documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. Here's just a taste. We want you to take this home and show it to others after informing yourself.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch it for free on YouTube. Just search 9/11 Explosive Evidence. And guess what? You can also get the DVD in our store, which includes 90 minutes instead of just 60 minutes. A lot more powerful evidence in there, as well as a bonus disc, which includes additional testimony from these 40 experts. I encourage you to go to download our coffee table version of the beyondmisinformation.org. The PDF you can download at beyondmisinformation.org, and or get the coffee table version, which is high quality for $10 or more, depending on the version. One of them includes the actual DVD, 9/11 Explosive Evidence. So really important for you. And our classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, is available free on DVD, as is the 15-minute Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner, all 15 minutes just on Building 7. Great way to introduce people to the information. With that in mind, maybe we have some questions, Andy.
Yeah, we have 4 questions today. The first 2 are really comments on YouTube, but maybe you can comment on them. First one says, I believe that the basement was set with large thermite charges, large basement blasts, which took out bottom floor, thus causing the 2,800 degree fires that cooked for months later, i.e. melting pot. Any comments?
As we'll see next week, when we get to part 3 of this series, the extreme heat, your suspicions will materialize as fact based on forensic evidence. I don't know that thermite could produce the intensity of charge to be transmitted 20 miles north and to create a 2.1 or 2.3 magnitude event, but certainly high energy explosives could, which is what they heard, like a train running under my feet. So the evidence of thermite may or may not be in the basement, but it was certainly in the towers, as you'll see. Anything else you have on that one, Andy?
No, I think you covered it. The next one says, the purchase of the World Trade Center by Silverstein, power down conditions for broadband cabling weeks before the event, the elevator renovation, pulling the sniffer dogs, extreme heat that lasted months after. I expected sort of a more after that here, but basically, can you comment on the work that was being done in the World Trade Center beforehand?
Yeah. We do have reports of bomb sniffing dogs being removed. There are witnesses of that. That's not evidence of controlled demolition, so we don't include it. Same with the cabling done weeks before the event, which, according to Scott Forbes, a witness, says that the 1/2 of the South Tower was powered down in the weekend, I guess it was, before the September 11th. That's not evidence of controlled demolition either, but it's very interesting and important auxiliary information. There was an elevator renovation, and I did see a question about that, so we'll save that for the next question.
Okay, next question says, I am extremely curious to know exactly when the demolition system was installed. Were they really demolished starting from the point of impact?
So we have a when and a where. Where these, sorry, I've got a bee attacking me. Regarding the when, it takes months. Even in like the Hudson building, the largest controlled demolition up till that point, it took months for engineers to find the critical points at the columns and beams and then the explosive loaders to load those explosives. So the question is, how do you get access to these buildings? Well, we know that tenants were moved around quite a bit in these towers in the months before 9/11. We know that the largest elevator modernization ever was done in these towers the 9 months prior to 9/11. And that would have given them access to the core columns and beams, which are immediately adjacent to the elevator hoistways, just simply by going through the gypsum board hoistway fire enclosures to access them. And there was witnesses of white powder on their desks, many witnesses of that throughout the tower. So it apparently gets into the ventilation system. I don't know. But this was really important because Ace Elevator had this contract and they came out of nowhere to get it. Otis Elevator had installed the elevators and had the contract to maintain them up until this elevator modernization. And it was quite a scandal because the Ace Elevator employees, 85 of them, fled. These are the experts in the recovery of the rescue of victims, because the elevator cabs can be used for that purpose. And they tried to use them, although explosions disabled many of them. So USA Today documented this scandal in, when was it? October, I think, of 2001. In fact, I'll write that down and include that article. Article. And as to where, since the explosions occur near the point of jet plane impacts, and they are independently placed and not in series, if you will, but in parallel, meaning they can be set off independently in case some of them are damaged by the plane. So that's where the explosions start. But as you saw today, they occur throughout the upper and lower sections of these buildings. So, but we're programmed by the official narrative to believe that the planes and the fires brought these buildings down. So that's where the main damage occurs first, to support that narrative. Andy, you have anything else to add to that one?
No, I believe you covered that. Our last question, it's really two questions, but I'm going to say them together because it sounds like it's from the same person here. First one says, Richard, will you confirm where in the North and South Tower the explosions causing the 2.1 and 2.3 signals occurred, and what evidence leads you to that understanding? Next one asks, Richard, will you explain why the evidence of the eyewitnesses in stairwell B do not confirm the claimed explosion causing a 2.3 magnitude signal?
Why the evidence of the witnesses in stairwell B do not confirm the claimed explosion causing a 2.3 signal. I think about that one, but I don't know. Well, what we looked at today was evidence that there was a huge explosion at the sea level of the basement by Mike Percoro, who testified to that. So that's where at least one or some explosions went off. I don't know where the others might have gone off. I have no idea. We're talking about before the plane hit right now. And then there's before the collapse of the building. I don't know if anybody knows where those occurs. Except that there's 22 eyewitness reporters, many of whom talked about explosions even out on the street. And we know there's explosions in the lobby as well. So anyway, I hope that helps as to where. Regarding stairwell B, I think I just don't know what you're referring to with stairwell B. I don't know if that's the stairwell where the firefighters survived looking up to see daylight above them when they expected 100 floors to be piled on top of them if indeed the building was to collapse in a gravitational collapse. Actually, that is absolute proof that the building did not collapse in a gravitational collapse. It blew out all the way down to those firefighters. Why they weren't killed in explosions, I can't explain. But that's proof that they weren't, that there wasn't a gravitational collapse, because they would have been buried under 100 floors and 90,000, 100,000 tons of steel above them. And I don't know if that was stairwell B or not. Andy, do you have anything to add to this puzzle?
Not really, other than 9/11 was an event that involved thousands of people there on September 11th, and we're looking at the publicly available information and the videos, studying the physics. If somebody has some specific thing about stairwell B and what somebody said, you can certainly write it into us, info@ae911truth.org, and take a look at it, and that way we'll have some context more of what you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Andy, for being with us today and helping us through. We have looked at part 2 today of 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Next week, we come back and look at part 3. We'll be examining the high-rise fires in more detail, the pyroclastic-like clouds, incredible heat, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. So don't miss that. That's at 1 o'clock Pacific in 1 week, today being August 12th. So that's probably August 19th. And then after that, we'll start again in September with this series and with part 1, World Trade Center Building 7, 47-story skyscraper that collapses into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. A fascinating study. Thanks, everybody. And until then, we'll catch up with you on the other avenues that we have available for connection. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.